Eric,
Omar.
it happened.
It did. It did.
We're back to another duo episode because our new co-host, the one and only Eric Trexler, is hibernating again. You see, because he was grown in a vat, he needs time to recuperate. He's been on 3 episodes in a row, and let me just actually be clear and transparent right now. To say he crushed it would be an understatement. To say that we're
Yes.
thrilled to have him as the third host of the Triumvirate is also an understatement. He's the man, but like all cloned humans, they operate slightly differently.
Absolutely. I don't think we should expect someone who doesn't have a belly button to be like the rest of us, ultimately.
Yeah, that's how you could tell. And what's Eric? I keep forgetting. What is his actual biological age? It's like 5 years or something.
I think he's turning 6 this year.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he's got to give him a little bit of respect for his age.
Yeah.
That's a big turning point. You're the third multiple of 2.
Yeah.
So, you're past the halfway mark. You can round up to 10.
Yeah.
So he's basically double digits.
And it's been fantastic. And now it feels so good. We have a duo episode. And speaking of which, Eric, actually, there's a few things to update the Dear Iron Cult. I want to throw out an appreciation for everyone that took the time over the last several episodes to welcome Trexler, and also just the comments in general. The subject matter of some of the podcast episodes really seemed to intrigue some of our listeners, some of our viewers. So the feedback, we're going to try and read as many as possible. Not right now because we're diving into a power episode, but I do just want to recognize every single person and what they say. We'll read more in the next episode. We'll keep this intro brief to get into the topic. But 2 things of note, all concerning the Helms. And that is the first, we have a YouTube video featuring the main hunk, multiplicity style. He's available on multiple platforms now, not just on Iron Culture. He's back on the YouTube, and gosh darn it, does it feel just right.
Oh man, I am so internet right now, Omar. I'm so back.
You're Threads.
So back.
Yeah, we're back.
Oh, dude, I'm on Threads, and not only am I on your YouTube channel, but I've been on a few, and they're relatively prominent. I am basically an influencer. And also, what was the announcement? The most important part that of the video that came out, would you say, that you released that I was just in? There's a specific announcement early on in the video. I don't want to say it because you don't. Yeah. What?
Rascal athlete. Actually, first Rascal branded athlete because it's on his heart. Quite literally, Eric, what do you have on your chest?
Yeah, so I think I've mentioned this before on the podcast. I'm not sure I've told the whole story, but for years, I've had the itch to get another tattoo. So I got my first tattoo at 18. It was something I had a dream about that kind of encapsulates my life philosophy. And then at the end of my Air Force training, I got a proverb, a Lebanese proverb in Arabic that I really, really liked. That I was an Arabic linguist. I spent a lot of time studying and learning Arabic. It's not like riding a bike. So all the people who hit me up like, hey, let's speak Arabic. I'm like, I can't anymore. So, some things are lost with time, but I do have that kind of engraved on me. So ever since then, that was, literally 19 years ago when I got that. After I got as serious as I have been into lifting, I wanted to get something to encapsulate my lifting journey. And I couldn't quite figure out what it was. And eventually it hit me. It's like progressive overload. It's the philosophy that we talk about here, but we apply it to life more broadly. And I was just trying to think of a really good image to encapsulate that. And I wasn't. And then I thought, what about Milo of Croton? The apocryphal story of the Crotonian young man named Milo who grew up with a calf and carried it. And as it grew, he grew. And eventually he's jacked. And then I was just looking for a good design. And then bam, coincidences of all coincidences, Rascal Apparel, and I am contractually obligated to say this, Rascal Apparel, best clothing company in the world and that ever will be, came out with a really cool design with the progressive overload, the picture of Milo of Croton. And honestly, some of the art for Rascal I really have always loved. And I was like, yo, Omar, I know this might sound creepy and weird, but that's the basis of our relationship. I think I want to get that specific Milo of Croton design as a tattoo. And Mama's boys, you and I, my mom wanted to get me a present. So after...
Didn't know this.
Yeah, so in 2018, it was either for Christmas or my birthday. I can't remember. My mom was like, "So what can I get you?" And I was like, "Actually, Mom, I want to get a tattoo." And she was stoked. So she went with me and I got tattoos. So my mom took the Rascal Apparel, design and helped put it on my body. So we are bonded through space and time, through our love for our mothers, and through my contractual obligation that is permanent because I literally put it on my body through Rascal Apparel.
Yeah, Eric. Wow, that's actually more profound than I thought it was. You pledge fealty to Rascal Apparel, the corporation. It's ascending, right? We're trying to become a corporate cabal of just various stakeholders and global interests. Don't need to get into that, but the motherly touch to really bring it right back down, Eric, to the listener and to make it relatable, and so they're not really aware of what's going on. Just a touch of genius. That's fantastic. I do want to say also, speaking of Helms, another update because you have been absent competing the last several weeks. You were on the episode last week, but by the time this episode comes out, and again, we take turns being creepy with each other. I did ask Trexler if I could just talk about your physique for the first 5 minutes, and he said, I'm not sure of his first episode. He said, I'm not sure how that's relevant to the subject matter. And I said, you got a lot of learning to do about iron culture.
Yeah, it's tangentially related to BMI. I think that's.
Yeah.
I think he's being too narrow in his thought process.
Yeah, and yeah, sure. The genesis of it is me thinking about you. Then I think about how it's related to the topic, but they are related. And that's the fact. I want to give a congratulations because we could peer into the future, and I do want to say it's a tachyon transmission. It's a very real thing. Look it up. I want to say congratulations, to your win. Turning pro, you have a competition. It's 2 days from when we're recording right now, but by the time they listen to it, the 2 days would already have transpired, and now it's Monday, so it's 2 days in the past. I want to say congratulations. If there's anything that's different to what you hear about from the time of this podcast, you're probably in a different dimension. We've talked about it before. I forget. Brandon will timestamp. Kai will timestamp. Brandon will adjust what episode we spoke about interdimensional travel. Nonetheless, we want to also give a shout out to our president of United States. We're both not in America, but Arnold Schwarzenegger. So, of course, we're all under the exact same dimension, the same reality. And I just want to give you a wholehearted congratulations, man, because what is true, and this is me being sincere, as someone that appreciates your physique, and I've looked at hundreds of photos and videos, and I've studied it, not as a bodybuilding enthusiast, just remove bodybuilding, let's say enthusiast. I think what I can say is that for the 2023 season, and I do mean this, you have absolutely improved. So it's wonderful just to see your own personal journey of doing the damn thing and taking it this far. Yeah.
Dude, thank you. And I love that right now I have Schrodinger's Pro Card, essentially, where we're 2 days out from me competing, but you're pretty sure from a tachyon transmission that may or may not be the reality we'll inhabit in 2 days that I've won a Pro Card. So that's awesome.
Yes.
I know at least worst case scenario, some version of me out there is a WNBF Pro.
Yeah.
And I may just put that in my signature in parentheses, not this dimension, and let people sort that out themselves,
I love it. And let's get to the topic, though, because this is a concentrated episode. Eric is competing in 2 days. And maybe this is a more season-appropriate episode because, Eric, you're getting ready. You're competing right now. But a lot of people start getting a little cooler. They start thinking about accumulating a little bit of muscle. And as I understand it, we're examining right now people eating at maintenance, at a slight surplus, and at a slightly more surplus, so 15% above their maintenance. And we're taking a look at how many gains they made. And I think some people might be surprised because actually one of the measurements that they are studying, or one of the places they're looking at, everyone's favorite muscle group, not the calves, not the chest, not the sartorius, the biceps.
That's right. So down here in the Southern Hemisphere, it's getting warmer, but I understand where you are in old Canada, as I know you pronounce it up there, it's getting colder. So it is definitely shredding season for me, quite literally. And it's definitely hibernation season. You've got your flannel, you're ready to rock. And I'm bringing the science to support your flannel wearing. So yeah, really good news. Literally just a couple days ago, we got the approval for our article to be published in Sports Medicine Open. And for those who don't know, Back in late 2018, we designed and started a study specifically investigating the effects of different size surpluses in trained lifters on both muscle, 1RM, and Skinfold thickness gains. So this was a rough time to start a trial because we got into the actual study after ethics approval and recruitment and everything in late 2019. I don't know if people have been paying attention since then, but there are some minor setbacks that set back, global economy in addition to our study and, might have killed millions of people. Yeah, COVID had a pretty big impact, unfortunately, on the study. It delayed it a ton. So that's why a study that we started in 2019 is only now coming out in 2023. And if you had your ear to the ground, if you were paying attention to the social media buzz, you might have thought this already got published. And that's because we published it as a preprint concurrently as it went into peer review and at Sports Medicine Open. And now it has gone through peer review. We got one round of pretty solid peer review with some really good feedback from 3 reviewers, major revisions. So I would really encourage people once it comes out. It'll probably might be out by the time this episode is out. It's pretty good. Like once you actually get revised in Sports Medicine Open, they have a pretty efficient process. But within a week or 2 at most of when you hear this, you'll be able to read the full open access text. And I think it has improved. The discussion was improved a good bit. There were some minor errors that we corrected, data presentation, more information. Like we didn't have a table on the actual tracked nutrition values in each group. And some of the more clear pre-post changes for all variables rather than just being presented in figures are there. So if you're data hungry and if you want to see more and if you want more nuance in the discussion and you have read the proofs, or sorry, if you have read the preprint, I would encourage you to read the actual published study. So one of the corrections they wanted was actually changing the name and or the title of the study. And we've joked about this before, how studies have these ridiculously long titles. I have been trying to buck that trend and have reasonable summary-based titles, and the reviewer's like, no. That's not nearly long enough. So it has been changed to the effect of small and large energy surpluses on strength, muscle, and skin fold thicknesses in resistance-trained individuals, a parallel group's design. So, yeah, the editor said, hey, can you please put that it's in resistance-trained individuals? Because I think we had in trained individuals, and they wanted to be specific there. And then one of the, it was either the reviewer or the editor, I can't remember, one of them wanted the study design listed. And I was like, okay, cool. I mean, you can find that out by reading the abstract, but sure. So title got changed, and there's just a little more data in there. So what did we do? This was a really cool study because people in the community who just wanted to see more data out there were part of the process of it being created. So shout out to Legion Athletics. We have had Mike Matthews on the podcast a while back. He put up, or I should say his company, Legion Athletics, put up $20,000 to help fund this study. It's not a supplement study. So it really was just purely to, contribute to our understanding and knowledge. In addition to that, Renaissance Periodization has been very generous over time. So shout out to Mike Itzertel, shout out to Nick Shaw and the whole RP crew. And they have provided funding to me for numerous years, just completely unattached, whatever I need to use it on. And we used a good solid chunk of that funding to ensure that we had really good ability to conduct this study. A dietitian, Steve Taylor, shout out, who was able to guide each one of the participants. So anyway, this was a multi-site collaboration where we were training the participants at Auckland University of Technology doing the resistance training protocol. And then remotely, we had Steve Taylor primarily for almost all the participants, and then briefly Brad Dieter, another Iron Culture old school episode. Both of those gentlemen are co-authors, and they were doing the nutrition control remotely. So they were randomly assigning them to one of 3 groups, either eating at maintenance energy intake, eating in a 5% surplus, so a very small conservative surplus, or a 15% surplus, something a little more in line with the published data on, hey, this is a good surplus to be in to maximize muscle gain. And these were resistance-trained individuals. So for the men, they needed to be able to back squat 1.5 times body weight or more. They needed to be able to bench their body weight or more. And they needed to have been training for at least a year consistently using both those movements with no longer than 2 weeks off. And, that's a relatively low bar. That's like a early stage intermediate for most people, but that's not to say that everyone was only at that standard. We did have some competitive physique athletes. We did have some competitive powerlifters. We also had some people who were just right around there. So it is a heterogeneous group of highly advanced through to intermediate lifters. Okay. But it's pretty good for a study. And if you look at research designs on trained lifters, this is definitely higher in that category. So, what they did was they contacted us and they were like, hey, I would love to be in this study and find out how I'm going to do this. They needed to be living in the Auckland area because they were coming 3 times a week for 8 weeks to train under our supervision. So big shout out to Colby Sousa, big shout out to Alyssa Joy Spence, big shout out to Casey Watkins, Dustin Aranchuk. These are all folks who were or are or finished their PhD at AUT, either under my supervision or not, concurrently. And they did a lot of work. We were collecting multiple measurements. So we did 1RM testing on the squat and bench press, as well as 8-site Skinfold thickness testing to look at the most relevant metric of body fat for actually visually what you look like. And then we also did ultrasound testing to look at muscle thickness values in the biceps, the triceps, and the quadriceps. Okay. So we were looking at those values, and then we were training these people. So 3 times a week, they'd come in on non-consecutive days. And they would come in and they did a periodized program for squat and bench press. They were squatting and benching each 3 times per week. And then after that, they would do a circuit of hypertrophy work that consisted of a back movement, a shoulder movement, and then a bicep movement. So it was typically like lat pull down, shoulder press, bicep curl, or like row, lateral raise, bicep curl, and variations on those, in addition to squatting and benching 3 times per week. So they were doing a total of 9 sets of squats per week, 9 sets of bench press, and they were doing 9 sets of direct shoulder work, 9 sets of direct back work, and 9 sets of direct bicep work. And then you could also argue that they were doing, say, 18 sets of total bicep work, direct and indirect. Okay, so that's relevant. I planted that seed for a little bit, and you did as well, and we'll come back to that. That's what they're doing. Now, the participants were encouraged not to talk to us, the people actually training them and pre and post testing, about which protocol they were on, because we can't really blind the participants to whether or not they're in a surplus, they're gaining weight, they're weighing in, they're reporting it, they're checking in regularly with Steve, our dietitian, and he's actually telling them which group they're assigned to. But they're randomly assigned to either try to maintain weight, gain weight very slowly, or gain weight more quickly. Okay, before they even got into the study, they did what's called the familiarization and maintenance phase. And this was, we wanted to teach them how to track macros, establish a rapport with our dietitian, and we needed to see for at least 2 weeks in a row them staying within an average weekly body weight of plus or minus 1% of where they started, so we could establish maintenance and make sure they were at baseline so that we had a good start. So then that's a big commitment from each participant, potentially, and for most of the time, it took them about a month to get through the maintenance phase. We'd also make sure that they could perform the squat and bench press to the standard, touch the chest, press, IPF standards, and then also squat to depth, right? So there was assessing whether they met the inclusion criteria, could perform the lift safely, and then were at maintenance, establish the tracking ability to be accurate with their nutrition, establish a rapport with Steve Taylor, our dietitian, and then they'd be enrolled in the study, randomly assigned to one of these things, and we'd see them 3 times a week, and we're training them, rescheduling when need to, making sure they're completing at least 90% of sessions so they could only miss 2, and working with them and getting them through this protocol. And then post-testing, same measurements again, 1RMs on the squat and bench, ultrasound of the biceps, triceps, quads, in addition to getting the Skinfold thicknesses so we can see change in body composition, right? So that's what we did. And the interesting findings were that while we hypothesized that we might see maybe some improvements in being in a surplus versus not, we expected both the small and the large energy surplus to get better gains than the maintenance group. We expected them to have better 1RMs, better changes in muscle thickness, but we didn't expect the difference between them based on some of the prior research in this area on trained lifters. And then we expected basically the amount of body fat you gain to scale with the size of the surplus, so that there'd be no advantage to being in a larger surplus. And in fact, the only thing that would happen between the moderate and the large surplus group would be more body fat gained. Now, our hypothesis, we couldn't really confirm because of COVID. So we were intending to have at least 10 in each group, and that would meet our sample size calculation for what we need for the primary measurement, which is the change in body fat. And it would be a decent sample size for the other assessments. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we only got 17 people all the way through the study. We actually recruited 21, but as you often do, we had about 4 dropouts, and these were due to scheduling constraints, injuries unrelated to the study, illness, or actual COVID lockdowns. And we would have had even more, but many people who are still in the maintenance phase and technically hadn't even been enrolled also had to drop out of the study because of COVID lockdowns. So, and then there were periods where we just simply couldn't recruit for months in New Zealand because the lab was closed. So that was kind of the reality of things. So we were unsure what we wanted to do with this because our a priori decision to do a group by group by group comparison, we were at half the sample size that we needed, right? We had 5 to 7 per group. And it's very difficult to make a firm conclusion about a 5 versus 5 group because if you have one person who has confounders or other variables or just is a hyper responder or a low responder, it can completely change what that group average looks like. And then your conclusions are only relevant in the context of that group versus that group in that study. And it's hard to, in fact, you should not generalize the findings. But we still did the a priori decision because we do as scientists and we reported it. And what we found was that the group that was in the large surplus group made better 1RM bench press gains, that there was greater increases in skin fold thicknesses in the moderate and the large group compared to maintenance. And when you just look at the numbers, it seemed to skew a little more towards the higher surplus group. So that's more or less in line with it. But there was no differences as far as muscle thicknesses at all, or 1RMs between any of the 3 groups. So the group versus group comparison, at first we thought, oh, wow, okay, so big ass surplus improves your bench, but it's no better than a small surplus for any other of the metrics that we care about. And more or less, you see skin fold thicknesses scale with the surplus. And that would have been fine. And if we just decided to stick with that, we could have called it a pilot study. I don't think we would have been published in Sports Medicine. They would have like, look, your sample size is insufficient. But in addition to that, we made the post hoc decision to go, you know what? We don't have to analyze this in a group versus group comparison. We actually have a continuous variable here. And what I mean by that is a variable that scales and it differs by individual that is not necessarily within the constraints of the group. And that's body weight. Because try as you might, when you do human research and you try to control these variables in an applied setting, these people weren't in a metabolic ward, we weren't feeding them food, we gave them instruction. They were living in the real world, and this is what coaches know and deal with all the time. Instructions are followed to the best of the capability of the participants. And we did everything reasonable that we could with the maintenance phase, the familiarization, having a very experienced coach and an RD control it, checking in with them, and even having some people who we excluded from the data collection because they weren't able to adhere during the maintenance phase. And we thought, this isn't going to go well. It's going to be a waste of both of our times. We noticed that the mean body weight change in the moderate surplus group and the high surplus group was the same. So what that told us was that just because you tell someone to eat, say, a 5% surplus, which is very small, doesn't mean that everyone's going to be able to have that level of minute fine control, and very, very small surpluses, at least on average, turned into something more similar to the larger surplus. But there were absolutely people who were on a smaller surplus and were able to follow it. And also there were people in the large surplus group who probably had some increases in NEAT, some energy compensation, or an inability to eat the kind of surplus they needed to because of satiety, who ended up not gaining at the rate they could. So that's why the two, when you look at them as groups, were quite similar in weight gain. But on an individual basis, they scattered in a relatively normal distribution of small to large amounts of weight gain. So we said, hey, let's just plot body mass gains and see how that relates to, just doing a regression, increases in skin fold thicknesses, increases in 1RM, and increases in muscle thickness. And the added benefit here is now we're looking at a sample size of 17, which is actually within the range that we estimated we would need, at least for our primary variables, to be able to make firm conclusions. So instead of comparing 5 versus 6 versus 5 or 5 or 6 versus 7, we're comparing 17 as a whole. So it triples our essentially power, and we can make much from our conclusions. And this is the results that are the ones I think we have the most confidence in, that are generalizable, and that we should really favor rather than the group results. And specifically what we found was that it was only 2 variables that were significantly related to increases in body mass. And they were, 1, increases in skin folds, and we had strong evidence for that, and a moderate correlation that explained a good chunk of the variance. And then we had a weak evidence that was still equivalent of significant. We use Bayesian statistics. I'm saying significant, but that's not actually quite the right terminology, but it's more understood by most people. But we had notable evidence that was very weak, that bicep thickness also was related to gains in body mass, but the evidence was like 1/10 the strength of skin fold thicknesses. So it's the type of thing where it's there, but it is what we would describe as weak evidence using a Bayesian model. So what can we take from this? That means that the groups, whether someone maintained their body weight, gained a little bit of weight or a lot of weight over 8 weeks with this training protocol, with these types of training experiences, had no influence on 1RM strength gains, tricep increases of muscle thickness, or quadricep increases in muscle thickness. So overall, there seemed to be no advantage, not even of just a small or large surplus, but a surplus period, at least in this study, except for this one small finding related to the biceps. So that was partially in support of our hypothesis that yes, body weight was the primary predictors. Yeah, you put on more body weight, you're going to put on more body fat over an 8-week period, even when you're training. And the thing that was not supported by our hypotheses was that a surplus would be better than maintenance. So this, if you're someone who's in the gaintaining camp, or I guess it's now called main gaining because people have short memories, then this is kind of a vindication. It's like, oh, bulking is dumb, you don't need to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's a lot of caveats here. For 1, this is not the only study on this. For 2, this was 8 weeks. For 3, we had some people who are competitive bodybuilders and competitive powerlifters, sometimes at the national level, being compared to people who just barely met our criteria. We only had 2 women out of the whole sample, unfortunately. Even though we recruited both sexes, we just were not successful in recruiting a mixed sex sample. So there could be some sex differences. I wouldn't anticipate there would be, but that's a good cautious statement about our relatively homogeneous sample that was more men. And yeah, so what can we say about just an 8-week period? It is challenging. Like if we're talking about relatively well-trained people, under any circumstances, would we expect them to see good gains? And when we look at the actual changes, not just the group differences, we see that there was only clear changes in terms of muscle thickness in the biceps. It was the only site that when you looked at all the clustering of individuals, like, okay, there was clearly an increase in muscle thickness when it roughly stayed the same on average, not for everyone, for the triceps and the quadriceps. Everyone gained strength as well. So that, not everyone, there were some people who were clustering, but there were clear increases in 1RM and there were clear increases in biceps thickness, but those were the only things that changed. So the protocol was sufficient over 8 weeks to increase 1RMs in bench press and squat and to put a little bit of thickness on the biceps and to put a variable amount of thickness on the skin folds based upon how much these people ate and how much they gained. And that's the overall summary. And there's a lot of nuance to talk about, but I'm going to leave it there and let you ask some questions. What's your initial impression of this data?
There's a lot, Eric. So can we put on Eric's coaching hat for a second here? And let's say, so flip off Eric the academic and whoosh, 3DMJ, thank you. What's the most notable here for you as a takeaway, knowing what you know about the general progression for athletes? So let's say, as you correctly pointed out, obviously the more advanced one is, the more muscle mass they've accumulated over time. You would expect someone to gain less or have the potential to gain less compared to someone who is relatively inexperienced. It was a pretty short time window. You noted where they gave a lot of love and attention to the biceps, and they're taking it, you're going to describe this like to failure. So that is also kind of unsurprising that there was some result in any event in regards to the biceps. But based upon what you know, and then the last one, I'd say what, as a coach, you're taking a look then, Eric, also at, we'd assume their body fat level, no one's very lean, because if you're very lean at a certain point, that you don't have those stores out of the line, let's say if you're at maintenance or your energy availability. So putting on the coach's hat and you're taking a look at this and you're trying to take a look at some takeaways or key points here, what immediately jumps out to you then?
The first one is a practical implementation of protocol rather than the results that I noticed as a coach. So people remember Mothra versus Godzilla, the battles that I've had with Dr. Mike Israetel. We've argued about volume progression, and we've also argued about, over the years, rate of weight gain. And one of his critiques that I dismissed, because it evens out over time, it doesn't matter. And maybe it would over a larger time period, but at least over an 8-week period, I think he's right, that very small surpluses, while they might be sufficient to put on size and they might mitigate some fat gain, they are practically difficult to track, implement, and make sure they're actually there. And this data supports that. So shout out to Mike Israetel. You were right. I think in the average person, maybe not competitive bodybuilders who, does color my coaching experience, but in this cohort, who are trained lifters and who were well coached on how to track things. Steve Taylor did a fantastic job. I couldn't have done better myself. They did struggle when told to just have a 5% surplus with the monitoring tools they have available, their daily weigh-ins and a weekly report, which mirrors what is done in most coaching practices online these days, to not be, on average, in a slightly higher surplus that was probably closer to the high surplus group. So I think for people who are like, yeah, Eric, that's great that I should only be gaining 1 pound a month at my level of advancement, but how do I even track that? I think that's a valid critique. And I think that if you are someone who struggles to have a small surplus, I think you absolutely could go, you know what, I'm not going to try to do that. I'm going to go with the smallest surplus that I can actually see changes from. Now, the only pushback I would have against that is that there's a lot of people, especially in the bodybuilding space, who they view it. If I look back and let's say I was trying to have a small surplus and I ended up being at maintenance, it was a waste, right? Like that didn't do anything. This data also pushes back against that. So while I agree it's difficult to track a small surplus, I disagree that it is highly consequential over at least the kind of timeframes we're talking about. Because in this 8-week study, there was very minimal differences in terms of muscle thickness that was gained, between groups. And yes, there was a small advantage for the biceps, but this is the type of thing, well, maybe you can't catch this on a 2-week basis, but you can over a 6 to 8 week basis. You can be like, oh, okay, my surplus is too small or it's too large. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable time frame to then make a small adjustment. So I'm only half making Mike Israetel right here. But I think it is true. It's hard to track small surpluses, and coaches would be well advised to assess that, because you don't want to give someone a protocol that they're going to fail at, right? So if someone doesn't have the nutritional acumen or structure to their lives where they can ensure that they're only in a 100-calorie surplus, give them a 300-calorie surplus, because why set them up to fail? Okay, so that's the first thing that I would have as my coaching hat, and that was in addition to the discussion that we got asked to do by one of the reviewers, which is an excellent comment, and they're right. The second piece I would say is that as a coach, I look at this protocol and I go, there's some significant limitations here. If someone came to me and said, hey, give me the perfect program so that I can put on size, I wouldn't go, sweet, let's do full body 3 times a week, squat and bench, and then we'll do a circuit of shoulders, biceps, and shoulders, biceps, and back. They would probably go like, well, what about hamstring curls? What about calves? So we're making concessions here. We have to do what is both logistically feasible for the team that we have to actually collect the data, right? We have to do what is acceptable by the participants, but also still logistically feasible for them. So this is basically every protocol you see in most studies is a compromise between those two things. Are we training your calves? Are we training your hamstrings directly? Are we doing direct glute work? Are you coming in 4 to 5 times a week like most of these participants are doing in their everyday lives? No. But is it highly controlled? Is it really well programmed? And are we pushing you to failure on these accessories? Yes. We did a high quality 1RM test, where we're getting the RIR RPE rating from the participant. We're tracking the velocity of the lift. So we're very sure of the 1RM. And then they have a percentage-based program that is then corrected by RIR and RPE. And it was a daily undulating linear progression. And almost everybody in the study got stronger. And that's something you can't say about most programs. If you grab a random program off the street and you apply it to 17 individuals, I don't think you can say with confidence that the vast majority of them will get stronger on both the squat and the bench press. We did see that. So from a strength perspective, it is a cookie cutter. And it's only individualized to the point of the RPE progressions and the 1RM test, but I think we did as good as one can do on that. But from a bodybuilding program design, I would have almost all these people on a 4-day-per-week program probably, and I probably wouldn't have it as a circuit, and there would be additional work, and they might have done more volume, right? So I think we can't escape the fact that this is probably not an optimized program for muscle growth, even though it does tick a lot of the big boxes. One thing I didn't mention is what other aspects of the diet were we controlling beyond just the surplus? Because I'm sure people are wondering. We required them to have a minimum intake of 1.8 grams per kilogram of protein, so protein was sufficient, and they could go over. And we required them to have a minimum intake of 20% of calories from fat, and they could go over, and a minimum intake of 40% of calories from carbohydrate. So we ensured sufficient intakes of all the macronutrients, and then beyond that, they could shift based upon their lives for flexibility and being able to fit it with their lifestyle, whether they wanted a more carbohydrate, fat, or protein dominant intake, right? And we had very high adherence on the actual nutritional intakes, even if the variable increase in body weight differed, which probably has to do with how accurate is their tracking, are they good at weighing things, how often are they eating out, and probably just differences in physiology and activity levels, where when you go into a surplus, some people expend more energy, some people don't, right? So those individual differences are baked in, and they're the same thing I see in coaching when I have my coaching hat on. So then if we think, okay, keeping the coaching hat on, why did we see some weak evidence that the biceps actually did improve with the surplus? The more weight you gain, the biceps actually got a little bit bigger. And that's when we can lean on the data again. So I'm going to swap my hats. Okay. So when we look at the most recent meta-analyses that we have from 2017 by Schoenfeld, as well as 2021 or 2022 by Bas-Val, we see that consistently slightly higher volumes, including indirect and direct work, are associated with greater gains in hypertrophy. So the 10 plus category of sets per week of direct and indirect work did show higher hypertrophy in the meta-analysis by Schoenfeld published in 2017. So if we want to optimize things, and if we're talking about on averages, not individuals, because some people respond differently with more or lower volumes than on average, you would expect the biceps to be the most likely muscle group to grow in this study. And that is exactly what we saw. It was the one site where at the entire level, if you look at all 17 participants, there was a mean increase by 0.2 to 0.3 centimeters on average. That was not seen in the other muscle groups. And they had less sets. So we had 18 total sets of bicep work in this study from a combination of bicep curls of different types on 3 days. So that's your 9 sets of direct work. And then we had lat pull downs, rows, and lat pull downs again for 9 sets of indirect work, which lines up exactly with what Bas-Val found, that, hey, 12 to 20 sets seems to be the range where you get, the vast majority of hypertrophy for the biceps, specifically 20 plus, no advantage, okay? And again, they counted indirect and direct work. So for this specific muscle group, the biceps, were actually falling in line with broad, big stroke, not individualized, but group-based recommendations for appropriate volumes. And then also we've had Zach Robinson on. We talked about failure a good bit. All of the accessory work, they were pushed to failure on. The squats and the bench press, they were periodized, and they went up to an 8 to 10 RPE in the last couple of weeks. So they might have hit a few sets where they were grinding and maybe missed a rep or two, but it was primarily submaximal in the 1 to 3 RIR range for the vast majority of the study on squats and bench. So hard training, and actually better training for strength, but not necessarily ideal for maximizing hypertrophy of the quads or the triceps, right? Which were the two muscle groups associated with those two movements that they were training. But for the biceps, because they were the accessory circuit, lat pull down, row, and bicep curl variations, every single set they were pushed to failure, volitional failure. We didn't actually make them fail reps, but there was plenty of failed reps that were going on. So the intensity was in line with the most recent data that suggests hypertrophy does scale more or less linearly with proximity to failure, and the volume was in the right spot, and lo and behold, the biceps grew, and even more interestingly, they seemed to be related. The amount of growth on an individual level was related to how much body weight was gained, which is an indirect indicator of the size of the surplus. So we can retain some hope here that bulking is not a complete waste of time, right? You could take the position and be like, no, the evidence is too weak, and I'll quantify it in a second for the biceps. Listen, Look at the quadriceps, look at the triceps, you look at the 1RMs, bulking stupid. Just main gain or gaintain, because you're going to get the same outcome, and all you're going to get is more skin fold thickness. And I think that's fair based upon the strength of the evidence. But you could also say, you know what? Maybe if they trained every muscle group like the biceps, which how much can the biceps grow before it's in partitioning the surplus away from, or away from fat gains? If they'd done that for the chest, if they'd done that for the back, hamstrings, glutes, maybe we would have seen some pretty good gains here. Coming in 5 times a week, they're doing everything that a professional bodybuilder would do in the off season. Man, we would have seen a much different relationship. That's possible. I don't know that we would have seen it over 8 weeks, but certainly that could have changed the data a little bit and given a little more hope. But now, Omar, I want to give people an understanding of just how strong the evidence was for skin fold thickness changes versus bicep muscle thickness changes, okay? So we didn't do traditional hypothesis testing. We didn't do p-values. I said significant just because I know that people know what that means. But what we actually did was a Bayesian analysis. Shout out to James Krieger. He did our statistics. And Bayesian analysis is a whole different framework from frequentist statistics. And it's based upon reporting the strength of the evidence based upon some prior knowledge. And there's a couple of statistics that it reports. One of the most interesting things is what's called a Bayes factor. And the way you think of a Bayes factor is it's a probabilistic odds ratio of whether or not one hypothesis is more likely than another. So what the hell does that mean? If I have a hypothesis that being in a higher weight gain amount, so gaining more weight, is more likely to cause more skin fold thicknesses versus that not being true, if I had a Bayes factor of, let's say, 5, it means, hey, if you gain more weight than less weight, you're 5 times more likely than not to put on additional skin fold thicknesses. Okay? So that's how that works. That makes sense, Omar?
Yes.
Cool. So the Bayes factor, thank you. The Bayes factor we had for the relationship, the positive relationship between skin fold thicknesses summed at all 8 sites that we measured and higher weight gain was 14.3. So that means if you were to take a random person out of the 17-person group and you said, okay, were you someone who gained more or less weight relative to the rest of the group, then you would be 14.3 times more likely than someone who gained less weight than you to have gained more skin fold thicknesses. So that's a pretty strong piece of evidence. We classify that in Bayesian statistics as strong evidence, okay? Additionally, then we have something that the listener might be familiar with if they read scientific studies. We have the actual strength of the relationship. That's typically reported as an R score, okay? The R score is just how linear that line is when you're plotting weight gain with skin fold changes. And then what you can do is you can square that R score, which is from -1 to +1. A positive relationship means they're positively related, increase one, increase the other. And then they are negatively related if it's a negative value, one goes up, the other one goes down. So this is a positive relationship, all right? And if you square that value, it tells you how much of the variance is explained by that relationship. What the hell does that mean? Okay, so that means that there's a lot of factors that are going to influence an outcome. In this case, the outcome we care about is increases in skin fold thickness, okay? And if these, let's take height and weight for an example. If we were to plot height and we plot weight, we would probably have an R-squared value somewhere around 0.6, 0.7, meaning that height explains 60 to 70% of the variance in weight. And that's something we observe in the real world. Taller people weigh more. They have bigger bodies. But there's also some really skinny tall people. So it doesn't explain all of it. That means there's 30 to 40% of the variance left unexplained. That is probably by bone girths and adiposity. And now we're probably, if we did a multiple regression using, let's say, measures of adiposity, measures of bone girth, and height, we could probably explain 90, 95% of someone's weight. Okay? Everyone tracking? All of you out there, Omar, you following me? So, in this case, it explained 49%, roughly half of the gain in skin fold thickness. So that means that in this study, out of all the variables that might influence how much body fat that they gain, 50% of the variance was explained by how much weight they gained. So that's a large proportion of the relationship and strong evidence, 14.3 times more likely. Now let's contrast that with what we found for biceps, okay? So now we have muscle thickness in the biceps plotted against body mass change. The Bayes factor this time is not 14.3, it's 1.4. Okay. So that means you're only 1.4 times more likely to have gained more bicep thickness than someone else in the study if you gain more weight in them. And it only explained 24% of the variance in how much bicep thickness you gain. That means less than a quarter of the explanatory variables that could be out there if we had perfect knowledge of everything that predicted your gains in biceps were related to how much weight you gained. So it is a factor. It's there. It is something, but it is absolutely like 1/10 of the strength of what we saw in terms of explaining, or the strength of the evidence explaining and predicting changes in fat mass gains. So right now, I think it would be premature to say, yeah, man, if you guys had just given them a similar amount of volume and similar amount of intensity for every muscle group and ran the study again, ooh, everyone in that study is going to be on the Olympia stage next year, right? I don't think that's going to be the case. And I think it's really important to understand that if someone's interest is in improving their aesthetic, you probably want to take a slower approach to gaining weight, because it's not going to be the primary predictor for even a good program or a sufficient amount of volume or a sufficient proximity to failure based upon our findings, even if it does have some influence. And you can always adjust over time. Like you run it for 6 weeks, like I said, okay, they don't seem to be gaining any body fat. Awesome. Let's push the surplus a little harder, right? So that's the general approach I would take, and I think this probably scales with training experience. The closer you get to your genetic ceiling, the harder it is to eke out more and more incremental gains. So when you have a early stage person, yeah, you can probably push these surpluses farther. And there's actually other data that have already been published that confirm that. And there's also other data that confirm our findings. So one important study that I've talked about in the past is by Gartha and colleagues, or Garth, as I've called many times, and most people will talk about the mispronunciation of the Norwegian last name. It came out in the 2011 to 2013 range, a series of studies on both different size surpluses and deficits. And in one of their surplus studies, they basically did a very similar thing that we did. They had the athletes go on a self-selected size of surplus, which ended up being small, or a dietitian-guided, relatively large surplus. And there was a 600-calorie disparity between these two groups. And it was in an individualized phase for each person in the study, so 8 to 12 weeks. And they found that there was 5 times more fat gain in the group that had the dietitian-guided 600-calorie larger surplus. No significant differences in performance or body composition. The only significant difference in this case was that the group that gained more weight more quickly got fatter. And these, importantly, were elite athletes from multiple different sport codes who were doing a 4 times per week upper-lower split in addition to their sport-specific training. So there's some concurrent training issues there. Some of these elite athletes we wouldn't consider well-trained lifters. You know, some of them were from codes of sports where strength conditioning is very minor, but others were like track and field athletes. And at the highest level in track and field, many of them could just walk onto a bodybuilding stage and place very well. Many of them have comparable 1RMs to powerlifters, and many of them have been lifting for decades. So it was a mixed bag in terms of the resistance training experience, much like ours, but certainly a trained group. And they arguably had a better training program, but maybe compromised by their concurrent training. So that study left a lot of questions. Is that generalizable? And I think our data suggests that, in fact, it was. We now have 2 studies on a reasonably well-trained cohort that indicate that trying to gain weight too quickly is primarily, but not exclusively based on our data, going to result in gains in fat mass. So you do need to be conservative. It's going to take longer, and it's probably going to scale to the size of the surplus over the time course that you follow it, the effectiveness of your training program, and then how close are you to your genetic ceiling.
Eric, with the time we have left, flip back on that coach's hat. So,
Done.
Key takeaway here. I think the hardest part for people to evaluate would be their genetic ceiling and where they fall in the spectrum of their own training. Because we have seen examples just anecdotally online, various people. I'm thinking of GVS's YouTube channel, puts out very good content. But let's say he reorganized his training, did a variety of different things. And let's say he experienced almost a second wave of gains, and I believe 100% the efficacy of his training, yada, yada, yada. So how does one, I think the key variable for people to try and understand, they understand, okay, like about the calories, not going overboard, their actual training program. But how does one evaluate, actually, Eric, where they are? Because one would assume it would scale fairly accurately to the amount of time one is trained, and then maybe like their starting weight to where they are now relative to their like height and yada yada yada. But how does one assess that key variable of like their genetic potential and where they fall in that genetic potential? I know we got like 5 minutes, and that's a big question, but
No, 100%. We got some time. I've got more than 5 minutes. I'll give you maybe 10, maybe even 15 if I'm feeling spicy. So there's a few ways to assess this. They both have merit. One is more limited than the other, and it's actually there's three. So I mentioned in our inclusion criteria that you had to have a certain strength standard,
Yep.
And that they needed to have also a certain amount of time lifting, and that's probably the best we can do in a study. And those are both useful metrics, but they're limited. Okay, and I'll explain why. Andy Bolton, supposedly, first time he ever deadlifted, pulled 600 pounds. Omar, you have spent your life working very hard to deadlift slightly over 600 pounds, and that's impressive. I have spent my life, actually slightly longer because I'm older, to deadlift in the 570s, and I think maybe one day I could deadlift 600 pounds potentially if you give me a deadlift bar. So the disparity between individuals just based upon what parents they chose is hugely different. So the strength standard gets us a little closer, but it can also completely discount the fact that someone maybe is never going to be that strong. Like their best potential is relatively low relative to everybody else, but they can improve themselves a lot. Okay. The time spent training is also a mixed bag because we've all gone to the gym and we've seen the person who's doing the same protocol and they have for the last 5 years, but they are clearly still at best an early stage intermediate because it hasn't been progressive. There hasn't been sufficient intensity and they don't know it, but they could have some landslide of gains if by actually putting a little more effort, a little more volume, a little more consistency, whatever their individual issue is, or actually eating in a surplus, et cetera, right? What I think is the best metric is your actual rate of progress on your lifts. So if you are able to see improvements, and I don't mean 1RM, I know people get kind of stuck on that if they're a powerlifting kind of centric view, but if you're like 6 to 12 RM on bicep curls, leg extensions, lat pull downs, like your collective kind of repetition strength, if you're following a hypertrophy-based program, across sets even, you can think of like your total volume for a given muscle group, like the density of your training even. If that is going up on a session-to-session basis, like every time you repeat an exercise, you can add a rep, add load, or the RPE goes down for the same reps and loads, you're still a novice, at least for that muscle group, which is another caveat. If you can do that on roughly like a weekly or bi-weekly basis, like within a block of training, you're seeing steady improvements. You're probably an early stage or mid-stage intermediate. If you have to complete a whole program and then you start the next program 8, 12 weeks later and you're seeing some advancement here and there and you're collectively going, yeah, I think I'm improving, I would categorize you as advanced. And then beyond that, like, shit, man, I didn't know till I was 6 weeks out from my most recent shows that I was really confident. Like, yeah, dude, I put on some substantial size to my medial delts and my lats, like 2 muscle groups in a specific region of them, to be able to tell like, oh, and that really improved my front lat spread, my back lat spread, my front symmetry shot, and I look better. My stage weight hasn't changed, right? So this is what we're talking about, like high level advanced people. I'm not expecting to see my body weight change in any substantial way because, yeah, like you can see a huge visual change by adding 100 grams to your medial delts, but it's 100 grams. Like, you know, like if I took a poo yesterday, like that's, and it was a small one, that's that, right? So at the highest level, it becomes increasingly difficult to look at body mass changes as a proxy for this. So unless you're going to Grant Tinsley's lab, right, you're not going to have the kind of data you need to really gauge that. So I think the best proxy you can have on an individual basis for you gauging yourself is how well are you progressing. Now, that's still challenging, right? Because if your training is just crap and you're not progressing, it doesn't mean you're a novice, it means your training's crap. So the assumption here is that you're actually doing efficacious training. You're doing progressive training. You're following a lot of those big picture principles. And that's hard. Now, just to give people confidence that this probably is the most important variable, there are other studies. I mentioned Garth, and that's the one that kind of confirms this whole well-trained people probably putting on mostly body fat if they try to bulk. But, you know, now that we have our study and it, I'm pretty confident in that statement. When we look across the other studies, we actually have a spectrum of different experiences. So there was a great study by Rosnick and colleagues where they found almost exclusive lean mass gains in a group of untrained participants, and they were consuming a very large surplus. They basically added a weight gainer to what they were doing and had them start weight training, and they put on 3 kilos in 8 weeks. So for the people online who are from America, that's nearly 7 pounds. And that was exclusively measured on the group level. There were certainly some individuals, and I'm sure it wasn't a perfect measurement of body composition. They're putting on 6 or 7 pounds of lean mass in 8 weeks and nothing else. There was no fat mass gains. But these are untrained individuals. So you follow a progressive resistance training program and you eat enough and you eat high protein and you train hard and you're untrained. Yeah, we've all had newbie gains. They're awesome, right? Now, if we just push that out a little bit, so Smith and colleagues, just a couple years ago, they also did a Bayesian analysis, so it's pretty cool. What they did is they took trained individuals, but they had a minimum of 6 months of training experience and no strength standard, okay? So these are probably what we would describe as late-stage novices on average, and maybe a few intermediates. And they found that, yes, there was a significant relationship between body mass and fat mass, but there was also one between body mass and lean mass. And this was in 21 resistance trained, like I said, but basically late-stage novices, individuals. And they found that if you look at the relationship, basically gaining weight too quickly, too much body fat. But if you gain weight at a more reasonable pace, specifically they found with the goal of gaining 0.45 kilograms per week, or roughly a gram per pound, that on average they were primarily gaining fat-free mass. But their R-squared scored, again, explaining the variance, was only 36%. Okay? So that means that, yes, on average, if you took someone out of that group of 21 novice but still trained lifters, yeah, if they're gaining a pound a week, it is all lean mass, but that only explains 36% of that variance. So that means like in 2/3 of the cases, you're going to see some body fat gain, more or less. So that means we have this study on completely untrained, early stage people, and then we have Garth and my study, which are on a mixture of people from intermediate to advanced. And there's a very clear delineation. You can gain fast and gain all muscle. You can gain reasonably fast, a pound a week, or like, which is fast, but it's not 3 kilos in 8 weeks, right? Actually, it's about the same speed. Could be, same speed. So, okay, so you take novices, 3 kilos in 8 weeks, which is about a pound a week, roughly, slightly slower, and they're going to gain all lean mass. You do that with well-trained people, it's going to be mostly lean mass, but some people is going to be gaining some body fat. And you do that with highly trained people, and they're gaining predominantly body fat. That's what the picture of the data looks like. So I think that supports it. And again, just to confirm, how do you gauge your own level of advancement? Yeah, you can look at strength standards, sure. Yeah, you can look at your time spent training, but ultimately it's how fast are you progressing in the gym, assuming you're on a good program. And if you're just barely eking out gains, that means you're probably relatively close to your genetic ceiling, and you should probably do something like following a slower approach. And I would recommend something like only being in a 100, 200, maybe 300 calorie surplus at most. You could translate that as a percentage, like if your maintenance energy intake is 3,000, I wouldn't go over, say, a 10% surplus, okay? And then you can scale that up to a 15 or 20% surplus over time. A general range that I like to provide is 0.5 to 2% of your body mass gained per month. So 2% would be almost exclusively for those novices or people who are untrained. 1.5% would be you've been lifting for 6 months. 1% is your intermediates, and less than that for the advanced lifter. And then if you're an advanced bodybuilder, you already know the answer to this. You don't need to be listening to me. But it's basically slower, or it's bulk and cut cycles.
Eric, that is the answer right there. I mean, I will say, as a side note, I think part of the allure for a lot of lifters, why they will still endeavor to do a bulk, is they want to see some sort of rate of change that is more noticeable and pronounced. And the concept, to your point, as someone that usually wants to maximize all given variables, if I simply eat at maintenance, so my body weight's around the same, and let's say, once again, you're around 13 to 18% body fat. That's a pretty wide range, but you're in that range where it's kind of hard to assess progress. So if you're eating at maintenance and you're putting, as you said, jokingly, but with some earnestness, like 100 grams on your side deltoids, like what's going to happen when you're training and you're trying to evaluate in the mirror? So the idea, I think, of being in a surplus for a lot of lifters still is appealing from a psychological perspective that gets entirely underrated, not by you or anything you said, but I just mean the reason why people will want to do that, because it's almost the illusion once you reach a certain point, like you were giving a heart to heart right there of the advanced bodybuilder,
Yep.
like just the concept, Eric, of an entire year training, like realistically, if you're near your genetic ceiling and like you're going to make a small but noticeable once you lean down or whatnot, improvement on your physique is harder to assess and stay consistent, stay the course than like, hey man, I'm gonna gain, let's say, once again, 1% of body weight per month. And then so, over the year, it's like over 10%, 12%. And then I'll lean down. Net effect, I'll probably weigh the same, but it feels like I'm on a journey as opposed to, steady Eddie, there I'm at maintenance and like, oh, I think I improved and I'm not sure. End result's the exact same, but the two journeys are very different.
100%. Like realistically, but I think there's also hope to be had here. And I'm not going to make this about myself too much. But
Yep.
So from my perspective, right, I've been lifting 19 years. I'm 40. And by the way, being 40 has nothing to do with it. It's just an indication of how long I've been at it.
Yep.
My testosterone is not lower. My muscle gaining potential is not
It's
lower
rock
because of
hard,
my
folks.
age. Oh, baby. I am just simply saying I've been doing this a while. When I first started, like my stage weight from my very first season is higher at the same body composition by maybe 5, 6, 7 pounds, right? I'm roughly the same stage weight, but probably 3 or 4%. Like I say, I'm gonna be super realistic and give some numbers here. I think I'm 3% body fat leaner than I was at the same weight, and I compete as a light heavyweight. So I've gained probably 5 or 6 pounds of lean tissue since I started competing, right? So me in 2007 as a competitor, I would have already qualified as an advanced lifter. Okay. So in some ways you'd be like, oh my God, 16 years to put on 5 pounds. But that's not the way you think of it as an advanced natural athlete. I think of it as how can I improve my stage presentation? And again, disproportionate increases, like you said in that recent YouTube video, once you start to get outside of like 1 or 2 standard deviations from the rest of the pack, you get evaluated differently. Running a 9.9 maybe gets you to Olympic trials, but running a 9.87 gets you to Olympics. Then running a 9.8 gets you a bronze. And then beating that, now you're a gold medalist. Those are minuscule changes that if we translated them to the world of lifting would not be worth it. I have to train how much harder? I have to do what? I have to do all this stuff I got to put in these years. Why? But if you're literally a competitive natural bodybuilder, then yes, putting in multiple years of an off season to add a centimeter of width to your delts so that your front lat spread goes from being, middle of the pack to winning that shot at least, has a measurable impact on your outcomes. And I am subjectively, because that's the way the sport is, better in 2023 than I was in 2019, despite if you were to chuck me at a DEXA, I really don't think it's going to be noticeably better. Because, like, honestly, I do think I wasn't even joking. It probably is 100 grams added to my delts. And like how much that's just not going to show up. And if you do similar things to specific body parts for specific poses, you improve your posing and other things that are unrelated to muscle gain at all, you can present better, right? Get leaner, etc. So that is a very different mindset to someone who is not competing and is just thinking about how do I get better and how do I put on or advance towards like my 85 or 90% of my genetic peak capacity, which is the vast majority of listeners. The vast majority of listeners of Iron Culture, I know, are not competitive bodybuilders, are not motivated by saying, hey, if you put in 16 years, you can gain 5 pounds. And then if you put in another couple years, you can not gain anything, but you can maybe see that one of your muscle groups looks better. That's actually discouraging. But trust me, by the time you get to that point, you will be encouraged because you will have really filled your own cup close to your potential. And then you're going to live your whole rest of your adult life having that if you maintain it and then looking for other avenues of appreciation, which we've talked about ad nauseum on Iron Culture. I'm not going to repeat it. But for a lot of people, and most people listening, they're still in that discovery phase, late stage or early stage. They're intermediates, they're early stage advanced, and they still got pounds or even kilograms of muscle that they can gain. And also, this is not a linear process. You mentioned GVS. Shout out to Jeffrey Verity Schofield. He's a great example of someone who probably thought he was at the advanced stage, but was actually at the late stage, intermediate stage, and figured out what worked well for him, and then had a landslide of progress late in his lifting career in terms of years spent training. I also had that. So a lot of that 5 or 6 pound gain that I experienced happened not after my 07 season, not after my 09 season, not after after my 2011 season, where I finally tried higher volume, higher frequency training. And most of that 5 to 6 pounds, I would say probably all of it was in my upper body. So again, when you think, oh, you gained 5 pounds just overall, yeah, if you put glutes and hams in there, that would kind of get dissipated and you wouldn't see much. But no, literally that was almost all my upper body, and it made a striking visual difference. And I had a lot of colleagues, friends, family, myself who noticed I looked a lot bigger in my upper body because I finally did the right thing for Eric. So Eric was basically advanced from the waist down and intermediate from the waist up, and I went to advanced from the waist up, and now I'm still refining that. So those gains that I made were not linear. They happened primarily from 2011 to 2013, and then I've incrementally found a little more here and there for certain muscle groups as I figured out how to train my back better and my delts. So I think it's that illusion that it's this linear thing or that it's going to be like that, but it's not. So kind of bringing it all the way back to the study, because again, I took a bit of a tangent. I think ultimately this is a great piece of data for people relatively early on who are still figuring out what to do, how to support their training with nutrition. But as always, nutrition is permissive to gains. Okay, you can set up your nutrition perfectly. You can have the appropriate macronutrient energy intake, but if your training is not sufficiently appropriate for you, progressive, and hard enough, it's not going to result in gains no matter what you do nutritionally. And I think some of our bicep findings also agree with that. So just make sure that what you're doing in the gym is the first thing you think about, because you really can't overfeed your way out of a bad training program. You will just put on body fat.
Man, that's just the way that Eric works. He ends with the quote that we should have at the beginning. Brandon, fix that. I'm joking. Say it again, Eric, one more time.
You can't overfeed your way out of a bad training program. You'll just put on body fat.
We got to make that an Eric Helms-ism. Like just the same idea, identifying a problem isn't the same as providing a solution. I really like that, man. I have nothing to add. I'm aware of the time. I look forward to the comments down below, considering what you just said at the end. I would call that, it's my favorite type, realistic optimism, right? Whereas, like, okay, some people, they want this idea that, like, we don't know what your ceiling is, like, who knows what, and like, this is true. It's like, but theoretically, we are dealing with constraints. What are those constraints? How can we try and therefore maximize it? And how can we view those constraints then differently, as opposed to just saying kind of the, Eric, we just don't know. Like, you just keep going. Like
Yep.
that's a very precarious position I think a lot of people find themselves in, where they want to buy into essentially what may be an illusion, but it's kind of the unknowable illusion, like where you simply don't know, as opposed to, I will apply myself. I will actually dedicate myself towards my training. I know it's possible. I don't know how much I have yet. This is probably what it's going to be. I'm not going to limit myself, but at the same time, I'm not going to do this massive bulk under the assumption I'll make an insane amount of progress. But no, I loved all that, man. We'll make sure we have everything linked down below. Shout out to you competing, and also the victory once again. Just check whatever earth you're in, just to calibrate, because we've said that we are interdimensional, and we meant it. Go ahead and leave a comment. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. You go ahead and leave a rating and review on iTunes. It does help us out. We do read the comments. We'll read some in the next episode. 5 stars is typically what people give. We're back every single uncertain date here from now until the end of time. We'll catch you in that next episode.